A very warm welcome to the third part of the XXXL Altcoin Ranking video, September edition. We've already accomplished quite a bit in the last two parts. Now, let's get to work on the last row. Otherwise, feel free to leave a like and subscribe for more altcoin update videos. Of course, I'll continue to keep you updated on my own positions beyond this ranking video as well. That's why it's definitely worth being here from the start. Otherwise, just a very quick disclaimer again. As I said, this is not financial advice. Yes, everything is based on my personal opinion. I'm not being paid. I have no financial ties to any of these projects. In general, another quick note about the risks involved. Especially when I talk about low cap projects, you have to be extremely careful. Definitely make sure you have a solid core in your portfolio. Things like Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana, etc., and especially with the high caps. But we'll talk about that later. And of course, you can always do your own research as well. For that, I highly recommend this video here with the ChatGPT agent. Yes, with that, you can basically check every single altcoin yourself using the new agent mode from ChatGPT. So with that, you're definitely in the know, and let's get started with the very first altcoin from the third row. We're going to take a look at Beam, which is one of the biggest infrastructure projects in the gaming sector. When it comes to gaming, we have Immutable X, we have Superverse and Beam, so Beam is definitely a good alternative to Superverse as well. Let's take a look at the token unlocks. It's okay, yes, you have to say there's still quite a bit coming our way, but for now the majority has already been unlocked. We won't see any major unlocks throughout 2026. I definitely like that a lot. There will be a bit more coming later on, but overall, the tokenomics are definitely in the green zone, so we don't really have to worry too much about inflation here. Coin listings are also available. The chart is currently actually showing a pretty nice bottoming phase. Here, it has to be clearly mentioned. When it comes to gaming, the question is, will this narrative make a strong comeback? Yes. At the end of the day, everyone has to answer that question for themselves. If the gaming narrative does come back, I can very well imagine that we'll return to previous all-time high levels pretty quickly. So Beam is definitely a top candidate here, and I've mentioned the gaming sector before. Personally, in my own portfolio, I would never take on the risk of a single bet, meaning betting on individual games. That would just be way too risky in itself. So it definitely makes sense to go for an infrastructure project that serves as a complete gaming hub for Web3 games. That's why, in this regard, Beam is definitely a good option. It's definitely fine. Yes, even from a purely technical chart perspective, we've now completely returned to the bottom formation phase. That's why, if you believe in the gaming narrative, you should be buying now in these bottom areas and not wait until we're back at new all-time highs. But still, yeah, to be honest with you, I'm only moderately optimistic about the gaming narrative, simply because I personally think that other narratives will perform better and dominate the bull run more. For example, the AI narrative, like Bit and Tao, or Layer 1 projects such as Casper, Sui, etc. I definitely see more potential there. That's why I would say yes, Beam is definitely okay. Yeah, you can go for it. In my opinion, it's not a big mistake, but you always have to ask yourself, if I had capital available, would I rather put that capital into other projects? We'll also talk about another gaming project later in the ranking video, Superverse, and I see a bit more potential there, so just so you know. Otherwise, let's move on to the next project, which is the blue chip project in the AI ecosystem sector. So let's take a look at it here. Here we basically have a complete infrastructure in place to be able to launch AI agents. It experienced a truly gigantic hype. In November and December, it was also the blue chip project, essentially the leading project in this sector. So here, you're definitely making a full sector bet on the entire AI agent sector. Otherwise, the market cap in relation to the fully diluted value is not entirely optimal. We can take a look at it here. As we can see, there is still a portion of the tokens that will be released into circulation over time. That's why we also see a slight minimal phase of dilution. Personally, that doesn't really put me off, because I also believe that we will see a comeback in the area of AI agents. We also saw it back when Ethereum started a good run-up. Virtuous Protocol also made a relatively quick comeback here. You have to keep one thing in mind. The topic of AI agents is a new narrative. Here, you need to be significantly more cautious compared to other projects. Even though I see good potential here, let's say, and we already have a somewhat established project, we still have significantly increased volatility here. We have a higher risk here than, for example, with a Casper, a Bit and Tao, or let's say a Chainlink, which have been on the market for a bit longer. A Virtuous Protocol is truly a new narrative, one that really only started to flourish at the end of 2024. That's why you definitely need to keep a very close eye on the entire narrative. But still, all in all, it's never a big mistake to bet on the complete holistic infrastructure, and thus on the blue chip project. Because at the end of the day, if an AI agent hype comes back again, Virtuous Protocol will definitely benefit from it as well. And we've already delivered quite a bit in that regard. We have all the Binance listings included, etc. So everything really fits together. We can also take a look here. Marketing is also very good. So they're delivering as well. So the overall package is definitely there. To be honest, I'm less worried about the project itself and more concerned about the narrative around AI agents. You have to say, especially with new narratives, the turnover is relatively high. It could happen that when the next hype around AI comes, suddenly it's all about AI and quantum computing. just as an example. And then it could very well be that the AI agent hype doesn't come back as strongly. So you definitely have to keep a very, very close eye on the overall narrative, but still in itself, it's a good project. For now, I would categorize it here as high risk, high reward, because the volatility is significantly higher than with the other blue chip projects. But still, overall, it's a solid project, which I personally still hold in my own portfolio, just so you're aware of that as well, for the sake of transparency. Other than that, the next project, Injective, I really like it a lot at the moment, I have to say. They've really delivered in the past few weeks. We also have a very, very nice overall package here. All tokens are already in circulation. We can take a look at the whole thing here using the token unlocks, and we'll be able to see that since January 2024, everything has really been available on the market. And I definitely like that a lot when you no longer have to worry about potential inflation. That was the big problem with Injective, especially at the beginning, that there was significant dilution of their own token. But now the whole situation definitely looks much better. Back then we saw that we had very, very serious problems at times, really, I would say, in building on a healthy foundation, because new tokens kept entering circulation, and that of course diluted the entire price. But at the current point in time, things definitely look good. We have all the listings included. We have a project here that is also moving in the direction of RWA. So with Injective, we basically have the possibility, for example, to have tokenized stocks available, meaning you can essentially bring stocks onto the blockchain, tokenize them, which is highly exciting. And there is definitely already quite a bit of substance here. We have a solid track record, and we also have good partnerships with other projects, which I really, really like. So in my opinion, everything fits together here as well. Yes, marketing is also in place, so they haven't just been sleeping through the summer or anything like that. That's also extremely important to me personally. That's why we can see here as well that everything really fits together. The team behind it is also really, really strong. We can also see here that general interest continues to increase. Let's take a look at the chart. At the moment, it looks like we've temporarily returned to this original level. So especially this original level from 2023 was touched again here. Dropping below $10 was quite significant, as we were really punished again for a while. But currently, the chart seems to be building up a bit better again here on a 3-day basis. We have this intermediate low here, then a higher intermediate low, and at the moment it looks relatively clean, so that we are continuing to build the upward trend. That's why, to be honest with you, at this point in time, it's actually even a potential buying opportunity for me personally. I also want to mention here that I am currently not invested in Injective, even though I really like the project, yes, even though I like it very, very much. And that's why I'm seriously considering actually opening my first position now, and that's why at this point I will clearly classify Injective as a potential buy. So I can really imagine that in the next few days, if the right prices are reached, I will jump in here. We can also take a quick closer look at the chart itself. So if we dip again into the range of 11 or 12 US dollars, if the lower edge gets touched again a bit, of course it depends on how you draw it. You could also draw it differently, depending on how strict you are, but roughly around 11 or 12 US dollars, I might build up another position here. There is also extremely strong support coming in at that level, and overall, the risk-reward ratio is extremely good. We can also take a look at the bigger picture. Of course, there is always a risk. There is always currently a risk that there could be another sell-off. But if I take a look at the whole thing, if I find an entry at $11, for example, and theoretically my worst-case scenario is at $7, so basically here in this lower box, sure, theoretically I have a potential risk of minus 37% here. Yes, but it's always very important to keep in mind, always have liquidity in reserve. So that's also how I personally always proceed, that I am prepared for a potential worst case scenario so that I can, so to speak, do DCA again down to, let's say, $7 or $8, which would really be the worst case in my situation. And apart from that, we have potential here up to the last high. In this case, that would be, let's say, 380%. That's a risk-reward ratio of 1 to 10. So that's really enormous when you take a moment to consider it. If Ethereum really reaches new all-time highs, if we see an altcoin season towards the end of the year, then we definitely have the opportunity here to approach the old all-time highs, and then there is definitely a risk-reward ratio of roughly 10. That's exactly how I personally always approach my investments, by measuring things like this. Of course, you could also say, hey Vincent, aren't you doing any DCA out as the price goes up? And sure, yes, maybe I'll already sell my first position at this level, for example at 30 or 40 US dollars. But still, yes, who knows what will happen with Injective. It's also quite possible that the previous highs we had, like 24, could be reached again. So I definitely see very good potential here for this cycle as well. That's why, for me personally, it's a potential buy at the current time. Then the next project, Render, which we're going to take a look at. All in all, I actually like it quite a lot. So as far as the project itself is concerned, I would say in terms of its use case, here we have the distributed GPU render network, which is basically the main use case here. Here we have decentralized GPU computing power, which is needed or also used to train AIs. So purely in terms of the use case, I like it extremely, extremely well. I'm generally a huge Deepin fan, yes, but still, you have to keep in mind here, we had an extremely strong Deepin hype, especially what we saw at the beginning of 2024 in February and March. There were quite a few and countless Deepin projects, But you have to say at this point, and you really have to keep this in mind, when we saw the next run-up, especially here at the end of 2024, unfortunately Render didn't manage to reach its previous high. And something like this definitely indicates relative weakness, it has to be said, if, let's say, this high point wasn't reached. That's why, yes, maybe you shouldn't view it too critically. Of course, it could still make a complete comeback, but these are definitely signs you need to watch out for if you're considering building a position here. Personally, I am not invested in Render. Yes, currently I don't have a position here. Looking at the tokenomics, it's fine. There is still some inflation ahead of us, but I would say the majority is already in circulation, which is something you would expect from such a large high-cap project. We can also see here that all listings are present, which is of course a positive sign. And apart from that, at the end of the day, everything depends on the deepened narrative, because the project itself is good. There's really nothing major to complain about. The marketing is on point, the team behind it is extremely strong, and the partnerships are in place. They've also delivered in the last few days, in the last few weeks, so I really like it as well. But you have to keep in mind, we're in the crypto market. Yeah, that's not always decisive. How great the partnerships are, how much has been delivered, or how impressive the use case is. As I said, purely from a technological standpoint, purely in terms of the technology behind it, I really like Render a lot. But you have to be very clear that Render has already experienced a strong hype here. That's why you definitely need to keep a close eye on the chart here. That's why at the moment Render is a candidate on my watch list. I'm really keeping a close eye on it because the project is really good, and if a deep hype returns, then I can definitely imagine that you could still get quite a bit of performance out of Render. But for now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm currently in observation mode when it comes to this project. The same goes for Near Protocol. We can also take a look at it here now. Of course, it's already a well-established project. It's kind of an old hand, also from the last cycle. Unfortunately, it wasn't really able to reach the previous highs in a significant way. But you also have to say here, of course, that doesn't mean at all that Near Protocol can't still make it in this cycle. Yes, I don't want to rule that out at this point either. The tokenomics here definitely fit. But you also have to add here, as already mentioned, it's a complete old hand. That's why we see here as well, all the token unlocks have already taken place. So we've really had strong inflation here. In fact, up until July 2025, we can see it now at the current point in time. We're now just about at the point where all tokens are completely in circulation. So basically 95% of the entire vesting schedule has already been reached at this point. So now we're seeing the last token distribution taking place, and after that there will officially be no more inflation for this project. We have a market cap of 3 billion, fully diluted 3.08, just to give you a reference point. So yes, practically 98% of the tokens are already in circulation. That's why we're now slowly but surely seeing a nice bottoming phase here. You can also see that pretty clearly here in the chart that right now, well, I'd say anyone who's really convinced about Near Protocol currently has a great opportunity to get in here. Let's say everything plus or minus $2. You don't have to buy in the middle of the range here, but if Near Protocol does something like that again, you can definitely take advantage of the lower edge to build a position. Still, you have to keep this in mind. So that's always a question I personally ask myself. If I had capital to invest right now, would I actually prefer to go with Bittens or Tau? So between Near Protocol and Bittens or Tau, I would honestly rather go with Bittens or Tau. That's why I also have Tau in my portfolio. I don't have Near Protocol in my portfolio, but still, it has to be said clearly they've delivered in the last few months. Near Protocol is not a bad project per se. All in all, I really like it a lot, and I can definitely imagine that a comeback could happen here. The marketing is on point, the substance is there, and they've really been delivering for several months now. We also have a certain level of security or a track record that has developed over the past few months, and that's why, in my opinion, the risk is now rather manageable. But still, yes, you have to say that projects like this always have it a bit harder if they've already been through a cycle, because there are still many investors from the last cycle who are sitting on losses. There are still a lot of investors who are holding their coins and will immediately sell them off as soon as prices reach $10 or whatever. So, generally speaking, the price discovery phase is very, very difficult for Near Protocol because there's still quite a bit of chart structure above us. And I would say that's never really optimal when you have a chart that has already been that high before in that sense. Of course, I don't want to rule out the possibility that something like that could happen, that we might see new all-time highs here again. But as I mentioned earlier, if I had to choose between the two AI giants, I would rather go with Bittens or Tau. That's why, for me, Near Protocol is clearly a blue chip project. You really have to give them credit for what they've accomplished here, but still, I'm not invested, and in my opinion, among the blue chip projects, it's actually one of the weaker ones. So in that case, I would rather go for something like Casper or Chaining. As I mentioned, I also have those in my own portfolio, or Sui, Bittens or Tau, just so you're aware. But still, yes, it's a solid project. That's all I have to say about that for now. Then the next project, which was definitely a clear surprise candidate this year, is Hyperliquid. I have to say, even I was personally very surprised by how well it performed. Let's take a look at the chart. We really saw one all-time high after another, while other altcoins were bleeding out or just stagnating. So you definitely have to give Hyperliquid a lot of respect for that. They really delivered, and I have to say all the on-chain data and the entire trading volume on Hyperliquid as well. What happened behind the scenes was really impressive. It's basically a decentralized exchange. So in this case, it's a competitor to all the regular exchanges, you know? Everything here basically runs in a decentralized way. Here you can accordingly open futures positions. You've probably seen that before as well. We can take a look at that right here. And of course, this is a very, very big competitor to all the other exchanges. We have to keep in mind that all these exchanges make endless amounts of money from all the fees and so on, thanks to all the users. And if, of course, an exchange comes along offering lower fees, better conditions, and so on, that can obviously put pressure on the entire exchange market. And as we all know, the exchange market is absolutely gigantic because at the end of the day, everyone needs some kind of exchange in order to execute positions. That's why Hyperliquid has definitely delivered here. Still, you have to be very clear about this. We're dealing with a project here that has a market cap of 14 billion. We're in the top 12 of all crypto projects, and that's why, for me personally, I'll be honest, the train has left the station here. Personally, I'm not invested. I did trade some individual positions for a while, but right now I don't have an active position in my main portfolio. That's why with Hyperliquid I have to say the market cap is already too big for me at the moment. I don't expect Hyperliquid to do another 10x or anything like that. Yes, even though, of course, the numbers are solid. So in my opinion, Hyperliquid is rightfully where it is at the moment. So there's a reason why they currently have a market cap of 14 billion, because as I said, the exchange market is gigantic and the volume going through Hyperliquid is truly massive, you have to admit. But still, as I said, it's a top blue chip project. For me, that ship has sailed. I won't be getting in anymore either. Yeah, just out of respect, I'm going to clearly classify it here as a blue chip project. But whether you should still buy in at this point or not is definitely questionable. For me personally, it's definitely too expensive here. If we take a look at the token unlocks here as well, we'll see that there's going to be quite a bit of inflation coming in at the beginning of 2026. And of course, that's not exactly a reason for me to build up a position here or anything like that. So you've heard my opinion on this. It's a fundamentally solid project that deserves respect, but for me personally, the train has definitely left the station here. I don't have it in my own portfolio. Otherwise, the next project, which was also a bit of a surprise candidate and has turned out to be one of the best performers this year, is Keta. Let's take a look at it here. The main trigger at this point was definitely that a former Google employee is involved in this project. That's why we saw such an incredibly strong run up here. Now at the current moment, things are cooling off a bit again. Of course, this could be very interesting for a potential position if we perhaps get back into the range of say 50 or 60 US cents. Something like that would personally be an opportunity for me to buy in again. So I'm definitely keeping a very close eye on this project, because all in all, I quite like it. Of course, a certain amount of inflation will still affect us, but there are also good vesting schedules in place here. So all of this isn't going to happen overnight. We can also take a look at the website here, and there we can definitely see the use case of this project. So there's definitely a lot on offer here. It's clearly a utility project. We can also take a look at the whole thing on their Twitter account. They're definitely delivering there as well. I don't want to go too much into detail right now. Otherwise, it would go beyond the scope if I were to explain exactly what Keta actually does. But still, it's a strong project with good momentum, and I can actually imagine building a position here again at 50 or 60 US cents. I don't currently have it in my portfolio. Yeah, so unfortunately I missed the boat here as well, and then it was just too expensive for me to make a significant entry. And here too I was a bit unsure whether I should already be buying. That's why it's usually advisable to wait and see how the structure develops. And that's also why there are clear indications that support could come in here again. That's why it's definitely on my watch list right now, maybe even a potential buy for me personally soon, but at the current time it's still a bit too expensive, so for now it's still on my watch list. Let's move on to the next project, which is Mock, also a meme coin, and actually one of the biggest meme coins out there. We can take a look here. 350 million market cap, and the tokenomics are also fitting. Marketing is in place. To be completely honest with you, I have a small position invested here myself just to cover the meme narrative. We're now also entering an interesting area from a chart analysis perspective, so you could really consider building a small position here, because there's strong support below us. We also have several order block formations here, and again support is coming in at this level. That's why I personally believe that we'll definitely see more support coming in here. If you compare this to the last interim high, you can see that we're now again at about a 50% discount, and if we drop back by 60%, you could buy in even cheaper. And you should definitely take advantage of opportunities like this if you believe in the project. As I said, I'm not paid by any of these meme coins or anything like that, but I still want to include this every time. It has to be clearly mentioned that the meme narrative was incredibly strong, and I can really imagine that when the masses return, all the retail investors, etc., the first thing they'll jump on will be all the meme coins, and that's why it can definitely make sense to build positions here. So at the end of the day, of course, we're talking about a meme coin here. Theoretically, for me, it could soon be a potential buy again, but all in all, simply for safety reasons in today's video, I'm going to categorize it here as high risk, high reward, because as I said, we're talking about a meme coin. At the end of the day, anything can happen with it. Otherwise, the next project we're going to look at is Destra Network. You could say that Destra Network is the little brother of Render. So we're also dealing with a deepen project here. In other words, decentralized GPU computing power is being provided to be able to train AIs. Let's take a look at the chart here. We've just come through a very, very long bottoming phase. So now slowly but surely there's a solid core of investors forming here. We can also see that some volume is coming back in. Of course, at the moment, the chart is just drifting along. What I don't like is that there's no good reactivity here compared to Ethereum. So I find it a bit unfortunate that when Ethereum reaches new highs, Destra Network just kind of drifts along. That's something I don't really like. What I do like, on the other hand, are the tokenomics. Those are definitely solid. The marketing itself isn't bad either. Alex Becker also talks about it again and again. You could say it's a kind of Alex Becker coin, to be honest. Otherwise, as I said, the presentation is good and the use case is there. But the same statement I made about Render applies here as well. Of course, everything depends on the deepen hype. Will it come back or not? So it's not really something that's specifically dependent on Destra Network itself, because overall the package fits. Where I do have to offer a bit of criticism is in the marketing, so I feel like people are a bit too inactive there. We sometimes see several days without a post, 2 days without a post. Again, here as well, a few days without a post. It's a bit of a shame when there isn't really a post every day. Again, here, August 12th, August 16th. That's obviously not great to see, but still, it has to be said, they have delivered updates. So there has been some movement in the last few weeks. That's why it's kind of a shaky candidate, or rather, if you're convinced, right now there are really great entry opportunities. We have a nice bottoming phase beneath us here. So purely from a technical chart perspective and from an investor's point of view, there's not much speaking against building a small position here. Personally, I don't currently have it in my portfolio, but still, you really have to keep a close eye on it right now. It could, of course, have another strong run up. That's why, for me personally, it's a high risk, high reward project. If the deepen narrative comes back, the Strahl network will also benefit greatly from it again, but it's a bit questionable, just like with Render. That's why I've categorized it there for now. Personally, I've put it on my watch list to keep an eye on it. Otherwise, the next project, Wallcheck, I can actually categorize right here under lottery ticket. At the end of the day, it's a small meme coin that I wanted to include, simply because we saw an incredibly strong run up here, especially during the last meme season. And even now at the current time, we're seeing a nice bottoming phase, and I think every one of you has seen this meme before. Right now, the market cap is only 23 million. If we take a look at their Twitter account, we can see that they're still posting some memes there. So they're still active, and I think every one of you knows this meme. That's why it's already relatively well known, and that's also why it's a kind of retail bet. If the masses come back, they're going to buy exactly these kinds of coins, and that's why I want to be positioned here as well. I actually have a tiny position in my portfolio, just as a gamble position, because there are also some listings here. Especially with BingX, Skate.io, Maxi, it's not bad at all when something is already available here so that retailers have the opportunity to get in. We're currently in a bottoming phase. That's why it's a complete gamble, a total lottery ticket. It's either 0 or hero. So something like this can of course also go to 0, but theoretically it could also easily do a 10, 20, or 30x if an altcoin season really happens and all the liquidity rotates through from Ethereum and the broader market. That's why this is definitely a candidate I'm keeping an eye on, because something like this could potentially even compete with Pepe, for example. So I can definitely imagine that something like this could reach several hundred million in market cap, but as I said, it's completely high risk, so be extremely careful. Of course, things can also quickly go the other way. Other than that, the next project that I really like is Ondo. It's currently one of the best RWA players on the market. We really have some extremely strong partnerships there. So Ondo has really established itself, I have to say. Ondo has really made a name for itself, especially among large institutions. So there's really a lot going on there. We can also see all the partnerships here, some even with BlackRock, and that's obviously huge when BlackRock is involved. So you really have to give Ondo a lot of respect for what they've accomplished. At this point, I don't want to go too much into detail about the use case itself. At the end of the day, everyone knows it, AWA. Here we have the possibility for assets to be tokenized and brought onto the blockchain. But what is personally my main focus here is to look at the whole thing from an investor's perspective. So I personally pay more attention to things like the chart trend, meaning the chart structure. How healthy is the chart behavior? What do the tokenomics say? How is the marketing, etc.? And there are definitely some clear points of criticism regarding Ondo. What I don't like so much on the one hand is, first of all, the reactivity to Ethereum. Ondo is kind of just drifting along. It's a bit of a sleeper, you have to say. On the other hand, you also have to give Ondo credit. Ondo has held up relatively well. So the core group of investors is definitely there. You really have to keep in mind there have been some altcoin projects that have bled out so badly since the beginning of the year, sometimes down 60, 70, 80, even 90%, and Ondo has actually held up well and remained stable. So you definitely have to give them a lot of credit for that, but still you could wish for a bit more reactivity towards Ethereum. That's definitely one point of criticism. The other point of criticism is definitely the token unlocks. Personally, I don't like that very much, because we're going to see quite a bit of inflation here, which will obviously dilute the token price. We can see here that every time at the beginning of the year, exactly on January 1st, 2026, and then again on January 1st, 2027, there are big blocks coming in, so big sell-offs again, and things like this have also led to sell-offs this year. We can see it right here, exactly at this point, January 1st, 2025. Of course, it was also obviously due to the market situation, but still, ever since all these unlocks, there has been a strong wave of selling pressure, which hasn't been good for the overall chart. That's personally a bit of a thorn in my side, I have to say. For example, I like Injective a bit better in terms of tokenomics because here everything is already in circulation. So we can build on a somewhat healthier, more stable foundation there, but still, in my opinion, it's not an obstacle for Ondo to also deliver a good performance. I'm still convinced nonetheless. I also have it in my own portfolio simply because I want to bet on the absolute blue chip project, the Alpha project in the RWA sector, especially since the partnerships here are so strong, including with BlackRock. So really, just a single piece of news is enough to drive the price up again. That's why, as I said, I'm invested here as well. One thing that can definitely be criticized is the marketing. So I really have to ask, what are you doing here, Ondo? Looking at the marketing, July 22nd, August 7th. So I wonder, why isn't there more being delivered here? And of course, I also know that this project is more focused on onboarding strong partners, really showing substance, so to speak, and demonstrating that there is real application happening here. A project like this isn't really driven by hype, that has to be clearly stated, and this is also reflected in the chart. But still, it has to be said that purely from a crypto perspective, marketing is an important tool, and a bit more hype could definitely be generated here. So I do wonder why Ondo doesn't at least put out one post a day. It would definitely benefit the project in terms of marketing. But of course, at the end of the day, the utility and the use case speak for themselves. Yes, you really have to give Ondo a lot of credit for that. That's why it's a blue chip project and also has a place in my own portfolio. I'm definitely still holding it. Yes, it might not necessarily be my first choice, but still, Ondo is a very stable project that I really like, and I do expect that we'll see good performance here. But still, you shouldn't go into Ondo with the mindset that you're going to get a tenfold return or anything like that. But I would say if you take a conservative 3 to 5 times return, you're definitely doing well, especially with Ondo at the moment. And especially from a technical analysis perspective, Ondo is looking very, very good right now. So we definitely have strong support beneath us. Here, the individual interim lows were never breached. We also have a slightly higher interim high here again. As I said, the chart looks a bit boring, but I can still easily imagine that if the RWA narrative really comes back strongly, the price will pick up again relatively quickly. That's all for now regarding the Ondo project. Let's continue with the next project, namely Toshi, which I just wanted to mention briefly. We have to keep in mind that the base chain is currently reaching one all-time high after another, or at least extremely high volume even at this moment. While many things are currently dying off, the base chain is still extremely strong. We are seeing increased volume, and we also have a consistently high total value locked, which also speaks in favor of the base chain. As a result, you can see that liquidity is seeping into all the memes. That's why I really like the chart here. The meme itself is also interesting. Back then, we saw that strong spike, and since then, the chart has developed in a really clean and solid way. That's why, in my opinion, it's interesting here again to build up individual positions at the lower edges, at the lower intermediate levels. As I said, I just wanted to mention it briefly. Of course, it's obviously extremely risky, but as I said, base chain is growing very strongly, and I can well imagine that the memes here, both Bread and Toshi, will benefit from that accordingly. That's why it's clearly high risk, high reward. The next project we're going to look at is AI16Z, which also experienced a huge hype back then. Let's take a look at it. At the moment, it's completely bleeding out, and to be honest with you, I'm not convinced here. I've also never invested in this project. Still, someone from my community requested it or asked me, "Hey Vincent, what's your opinion on this?" Personally, I wouldn't invest here. As I said, I don't particularly like it, and especially the current market cap of 115 million is, even for this project, still too high for me at the moment. It has absolutely zero reactivity to Ethereum. So in this case, it might actually be more interesting to set up a short bot or maybe a neutral grid trading bot, which would then generate profits again and again as it moves through the individual grids. So a chart like this is actually interesting for a negative trading bot, but purely from an investment perspective, I wouldn't keep a project like this in my portfolio. Even if I did have it in my portfolio, I would actually reallocate it into other projects. Because something like this definitely doesn't look good at all, and that's why it also falls into the category of it's okay. Yeah, so I only included it because someone from my community requested it, but at this point I wouldn't invest in it, especially since with these DeFi AI projects, the coming and going is incredibly fast. We saw it ourselves, the pump back then was absolutely gigantic. It was really incredible how much hype built up here, but just as quickly, it can head south again. So you definitely have to be careful, especially with such new projects. That's all I have to say about that for now. Now the next project, which is also an extremely exciting newcomer, is Sei. Let's take a look at it here. I've actually come to like it more and more over time, I have to say. Here we have an incredibly strong layer 1. We can take a look at it on the website, the fastest layer 1. At this point, it has to be said very clearly. It doesn't matter if you have the best layer 1 blockchain, the fastest blockchain, or the most transactions per second, or whatever else. In the end, all of that means nothing if there are no applications being built. But here, especially with Say, I have to say that they've now established some good partnerships. We've also seen some good developments in the last few weeks. So they've really delivered, and that's why I'm keeping an extremely close eye on Say. For example, we can also see here that real growth is happening in the background, and that's an incredibly positive sign for a project like this. For me personally, it's now even a strong competitor to SUI. We can even take a look at what SUI's current market cap is, just to get a rough idea. If we look at SUI at the current moment, it has a market cap of 11.6 billion, and in this case, Say is currently at 1.7 billion, so there's definitely still a lot of potential there. Back at the beginning of 2024, we were also significantly higher, and unfortunately we didn't surpass the all-time high here either, but currently the chart is slowly but surely building up with higher interim lows and higher interim highs. We can also take a look at the chart here. If we draw a Fibonacci level here as well, we get a few reference points. We have the golden pocket where we were rejected once, and otherwise at the current time at the 0.236 level. Unfortunately, we haven't managed to break through either, but overall, yes, the prices are currently okay. Yes, I'm actually already considering building my first position soon. To be honest with you, right now it's still a bit too expensive for me. I can even imagine that we might pull back a bit here, and we have to keep in mind that on the chart, that's a drop of 30 to 40% right away. So you definitely still need to be cautious at the moment, but if you start DCAing slowly but surely, I think you'll be in a pretty good position because real results are being delivered here. I really like this layer 1 a lot. It's a competitor to SUI, and I can easily imagine, as we've already seen with SUI, how the chart developed quite well, that something similar could also happen with Say. Especially with layer 1 blockchains, as I said, you definitely have to be careful because there are countless ones out there. We also talked about CKB briefly. It's also a good layer 1 in itself, but here too, the question always remains, will all the projects come back or not? You really have to ask yourself that question twice, but for me personally, it's definitely a potential buy soon, nonetheless. As I said, it's important to mention that at the current time, not yet. However, if certain price levels are reached, for example down here at 20 US cents, I will start building initial positions because that's when stronger support comes in again. Especially this lower box that I had drawn in, if we slowly but surely move back into this accumulation box, then it definitely becomes interesting for me again to start building positions. We can also see at the current moment, if I just make a quick digression here, that we currently have a fear and greed index of just 39. So, in a sense, we've returned to a state of fear, and that's why, overall, it is definitely becoming very, very interesting again for new positions, meaning to find further entry points here. So if we come back strongly into this box again and do something like that, I will definitely jump in here as well at the current or possibly upcoming prices. Otherwise, I will now keep a very, very close eye on the chart here. That's why it's definitely a potential buy candidate for me soon. Otherwise, the second to last project in terms of ranking, then we're almost done. Superverse is also a Web3 gaming hub here, similar to Beam, also similar to Immutable X, or even Scala back in the day, if any of you still remember it from the last cycle. For me personally, if you want to bet on the gaming sector, Superverse is, in my opinion, one of the best projects out there. Personally, I am not invested at the current time, because as I said, I am still a bit cautious when it comes to the gaming narrative. You definitely have to keep a close eye on the narrative itself. Whether another strong hype will be generated here is something that definitely needs to be watched. Otherwise, if we take a look at the tokenomics, at the vesting schedule, in other words, how much inflation we can expect to hit us, you have to say there's still quite a lot coming our way. We can see here what is planned. But we also have to keep in mind that this whole thing runs until 2036. So there's still quite a bit of time, several years ahead of us. What's really interesting to watch is what happens in the next 12 months, because that I'd say will be decisive for the chart. That's why, while it's still kind of, let's say, mediocre, it's not a complete disaster. I mean, if all of this were to happen over the next few months, it would definitely be catastrophic. But in this case, it's really spread out over a very, very long period of time. So in this respect, it's definitely manageable, you have to say. That's why you really need to keep an eye on the chart here. For me personally, it becomes interesting again to consider making potential purchases, actually building a position here as well, especially around the 40 US cents mark. If you can possibly take advantage of a discount here of around 35%, that would definitely be very, very pleasant, especially if real fear returns to the crypto market and you get another point of contact here, which would be the third one in this case. So in that case, you would definitely want to build up another position. We have to keep in mind that Superverse has repeatedly dipped into this consolidation box. If you build a position here at 40 US cents or 38, you can relatively quickly make a 1x or even 1.5x gain. So a good doubling in a relatively short time, because the same thing has happened here again and again. So we actually see this happening again and again. We have strong run-ups, then a consolidation box again, run-up, consolidation box. It's basically the same behavior repeating itself. That's why, in my opinion, you can't really go too wrong if you take advantage of the low prices here to build up positions. So this is definitely very, very appealing in terms of the risk-reward ratio, because if you ever get the chance here again, we can take a look with a long position, then it's really incredible what kind of potential risk-reward ratio you can get here up to the next high. If you measure the whole thing up to the high point from November 2024, you'll see that in this case, you could actually achieve a solid 5x return. And I can honestly imagine that these highs will definitely be reached again in a proper altcoin season. So if the gaming narrative really comes back, we could see prices here of $3 or even $4. Of course, that's always a bit of an open question, but overall, there's a lot going for this project. And personally, as I mentioned earlier, I prefer to bet on the overall infrastructure rather than on individual games. That's why this is definitely a very, very interesting project. As I said, at the moment, it's still a bit too expensive for me. Otherwise, I would have almost included it here. But for now, it's still on my watch list, and I can definitely see myself buying in soon, so you guys are in the loop. Now, the last project from the XXXL altcoin ranking video that we're going to look at is Arrow. Let's take a look at the website here. It's basically the DeFi protocol for the base chain. Here we can see the chart for Aerodrome Finance. With a current market cap of 1 billion, it has definitely already established itself quite well. And as I said, we always have to take a look behind the scenes and see what's really happening there. We can clearly see that the base chain is growing rapidly, and naturally the DeFi protocol is benefiting from that as well. That's why this project is incredibly exciting for me, personally, as a way to bet on the base chain. Especially, of course, if you're a bit cautious when it comes to meme coins. As we mentioned, Brad runs on the base chain, Toshi runs on the base chain. So if you're a bit skeptical here, Arrow is a top alternative to still get in on the base bet. That's why I actually want to build a position here for myself. So I'm really excited to make another purchase here. Currently, I'm not invested yet. I want to make that very clear. But as soon as we drop back down to certain price levels here, specifically to this lower edge, maybe around plus or minus 80 US cents, it would personally be a candidate for me to buy more. At the moment, for me personally, it's still a bit too expensive because we have a clear structure here with the interim lows, interim low, interim low, interim low, and something like that could definitely happen again. Then you could buy in a bit cheaper, maybe here again with a discount of minus 26%. That definitely wouldn't be bad at all if we were to see prices like that again here. And as I said, for me personally, the best way is to bet on the base chain. We have to keep in mind that the base chain doesn't have its own token. For example, in the case of Solana or Ethereum, we always have the respective coin for each blockchain, so to speak. That's not the case with the base chain, and that's why it's especially interesting to invest in the infrastructure there. Currently, we're bleeding out a bit, but as soon as important support levels come in here again, I'll be buying in as well. That's why, for me personally, this is also categorized as a potential buy, but only if the corresponding prices are reached. At the moment, I'm not buying yet. I also don't currently have it in my portfolio, but I will buy in as soon as the price is around 80 US cents. At the latest at this Fibonacci level, I will definitely buy in again. As I said, there is also strong resistance above us at the moment. Here we have the Fibonacci golden pocket level. It's quite possible that we might get some brief support here, but then there's also the possibility that this structure will be extended with a higher intermediate low, and that's definitely a point where you can build up another position. That's definitely the plan from my side. I think at this point you've gotten a pretty good overview of my current assessment of the overall altcoin market. Just to sum up briefly, as I already mentioned, definitely be cautious, especially with the smaller ones. Especially with the lottery ticket projects or those on my watch list, you still need to keep an eye on them for now. But there are also clear opportunities that we can currently identify in the market, especially when I look at the fear and greed index. We are now back in a bit of fear, and as soon as we slowly but surely dip into fear, it can definitely make sense to start building certain positions again, because some projects are being disproportionately punished. That's why, as I said, you've gotten a completely comprehensive insight here. If you enjoyed the entire video series, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. I would really appreciate your support. Of course, feel free to leave a comment or share this video with your crypto colleagues. Otherwise, if you're completely new to the crypto market, I can only recommend Bitpanda to you. I've linked it in the video description. It's a top-notch MyCA regulated exchange. I personally also use it for fiat on and off ramp, basically for depositing and withdrawing. It's really convenient. And otherwise, I've linked everything else in the video description as well. So my Telegram channel, my Telegram group, and all my indicators, you can get them here too if you join my Telegram group for free. So as I said, everything is explained again in the video description. Otherwise, I sincerely thank you for your attention. It was definitely an incredible amount of work to prepare everything, but I also really enjoyed it a lot. Altcoin videos in particular always bring me a lot of joy because of course I'm personally invested here as well, and I see huge opportunities, especially once Ethereum reaches new all-time highs, Bitcoin dominance drops, and hopefully by the end of the year, the altcoin season will take place. So I'm definitely still optimistic, especially once Ethereum reaches those new highs in a significant way. That's my current assessment in any case. And don't forget to check out the other YouTube videos as well. Of course, you're welcome to watch the JetGPT agent video afterwards or my XXXL trading video course. I've linked it for you right up here in the top left. You're definitely welcome to tune in right after this. Otherwise, as I said, feel free to like, subscribe, and comment, and I'll see you again in the next videos.